They sold human flesh in their artisanal pays for years, and everyone asked for more. Hello, everyone. Before we begin this terrifying story that really happened in the south of France in 1889, I'd like to know where you're listening from right now. Are you comfortably seated at home or perhaps on public transport? Leave us a comment. And if you like blood-curdling true stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell because trust me, after hearing what was behind the counter of a simple neighborhood market, you'll never look at traders the same way again. Come on, settle in. This story will haunt you long after you've heard it. The September sun gently warmed the worn cobblestones of the market street in the small neighborhood of Aurillac in the south of France. It was a morning like any other in the year 9. Music, the air carried the smell of fresh bread. Coming from the bakeries, the cries of street vendors echoed between the white stone facades, and the neighborhood's housewives hurried with their wicker baskets to buy the week's groceries. At number 14, on this narrow, bustling street was the butcher's shop owned by the White brothers Edouard and Armand Blanc. The shop, modest but impeccably kept, had become a true institution in the neighborhood in just a few years. The windows still shone, the white glazing of the counter sparkled, and, above all, their artisanal products, country pâté, homemade terrine, dry sausage, and black pudding, were renowned for their absolutely incomparable flavor. Madame Beaumont, radiant as ever, called out to Edouard with her usual warm smile as one of her regular customers entered. He was a very pleasant man in his 40s, with a carefully trimmed brown mustache and hazel eyes that sparkled with bonhomie. He wore an immaculate apron despite the already late hour of the morning. Madame Beaumont, a widow in her 50s with a round face and rosy cheeks, smiled back. "Good morning, Edouard. I need your wonderful pâté for dinner tonight. The priest is coming to eat at home, and you know how much he appreciates your work." "Ah, the father of the field, what an honor." Edouard turned toward the back room. "Armand, bring us the special pâté, the one we made yesterday." His brother appeared from the back room, taller and thinner than Edouard, with the same hazel eyes but a more angular, almost stern face. Armand was the man in the shadows, the one who prepared the mixtures, who ground the meat in the back room while Edouard charmed the customers. In his strong hands he held a terrine wrapped in wax paper. "Here you are, madam," Armand said in a deep, calm voice, placing the package on the counter with almost ceremonial delicacy. "Our family recipe. The secret is in the blend of spices and, of course, in the quality of the meat." Madame Beaumont paid her 4 francs, then left satisfied, her basket a little heavier. When the doorbell marked her departure, Edouard and Armand exchanged a simple glance that lasted only a fraction of a second, but which carried within it something indefinable, something cold. The day continued as usual. Customers filed in. Madame Garnier for her favorite sausages, Monsieur Pereiro for a piece of black cheese, and young Philippe Mercier, who came to pick up the weekly order from his boss, the owner of the restaurant Le Sanglier d'Or. "Ami Philippe," asked Edouard, carefully wrapping up the citrine, "how's your boss? Is business good at the restaurant?" The young man, barely 20, with tousled blonde hair and a face marked by the acne of youth, nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yes, Monsieur Blanc, ever since he put your pâté on the menu, we've been full. Parisian customers who come down south speak of it as the best they've ever tasted." Edouard puffed out his chest proudly. "It's because we work with passion, my boy. Isn't that right, Armand?" In the back room, Armand replied with a simple grunt. He was busy meticulously cleaning the large wooden work table, scrubbing away the slightest traces with a stiff brush. The strong smell of black soap mingled with the aromas of meat and spices. As Philippe left with his order, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Thérèse Morel, the upstairs neighbor. A thin woman in her 40s, always dressed in black since her husband's death 5 years earlier, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and a perpetually worried face. "Me, Mr. White," she said hesitantly. "Forgive me for disturbing you." Edouard looked up, his smile becoming a little more strained. "Mrs. Morel, what can I do for you?" She nervously twisted a handkerchief between her bony hands. "It's about the smell, the one that's been coming from your cellar for the past few days. It smells different, like something rotten. It's wafting up to my house, and in this September heat." Edouard's smile didn't work, but his eyes hardened imperceptibly. "Ah, Mrs. Morel, you must be talking about the new batch of tripe we received. The supplier delivered something that wasn't quite fresh. We immediately threw it away, of course." Armand came out of the back room, wiping his hands on his apron. Everything was cleaned this morning, madam. The smell should disappear by this evening. Please accept our apologies for the inconvenience." Therese Morel nodded, not entirely convinced but too polite to insist. "Very well, thank you, gentlemen." After he left, the two brothers remained silent for a long time. Edouard closed the shop door and flipped the open sign to read, "Closed." "Although it's barely 2:00 p.m., she's going to become a problem," Armand said quietly. Edouard rubbed his temples. "Not if we're careful. We just have to be more careful with storage." "Storage isn't the problem," Armand replied curtly. "The problem is that we have to restock. Don't worry, tomorrow's pâté won't make itself." Edouard nodded slowly, looking towards the door leading to the basement. "You're right. Tonight we'll go back." Night fell on Aurillac, bringing with her a welcome freshness after the heat of the day. The Russians gradually emptied. The gas lanterns lit one by one, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. At number 14 Market Street, all the lights were off, except for a faint glow that filtered through the closed shutters of the back room. In the basement, by the flickering light of two oil lamps, Edouard and Armand Blanc worked in silence. The low ceiling and the stone walls were damp. The air was thick, laden with a metallic, acrid odor that would have made anyone else vomit, but not them. They were used to it. On the large work table in the center of the room lay something wrapped in a thick cloth. Armand slowly undid the knots, revealing what lay beneath. Edouard methodically sharpened a long knife, mouthfuls on a sharpening stone. The steady grinding of metal on stone echoed ominously in the confined space. "We'll have to make this one last at least 2 weeks," Edouard murmured. "We can't afford to be too greedy." Armand nodded, unfolding the canvas completely. "People are starting to ask questions about the disappearances. I heard Madame Garnier talking about them at the market this morning." "Vagabonds and strangers," Edouard replied with a shrug. "No one's really looking for them, and if they are, they'll never think to look at their plates." A cold smile stretched Armand's lips. "The perfect pastry, our masterpiece." They set to work, their movements precise and methodical, like artisans going about their daily tasks. For that was exactly what they had become. Artisans of evil, perfecting their horrible craft in the darkness of this damp basement, while the world continued to spin above their heads, unaware of the horror lurking just beneath their feet. And tomorrow, the sun would rise again over the market street. Customers would return, smiling and trusting, asking for the famous pâté des frères blancs, and no one, absolutely no one, would suspect the terrible truth hidden behind the incomparable taste of their star product. No one, except perhaps Therese Morel, whose window looked directly onto the alleyway. Late one night, she had just seen a suspicious shadow enter through the back door of the butcher's shop, carrying something heavy on its shoulder. October arrived with its cold rains and morning mists that enveloped the market like a grayish shroud. The leaves of the plane trees that lined the market square took on coppery hues and fell like a slippery carpet onto the wet cobblestones. It was a melancholy time when the days were getting shorter and people hurried home before nightfall. In the small room above the White Brothers butcher shop, Therese Morel sat by her window, a cup of herbal tea cooling in her hands. She hadn't slept a wink all night. Since that September evening when she saw that mysterious shadow, her mind had been constantly earning in circles, assembling pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to complete. Disappearances. It wasn't new in Uyak. In every city, people left, disappeared, vanished for various reasons. But Therese had started to count, to remember. There had been the Italian peddler Salvatore who had passed through the neighborhood in July and was never seen again. Then that young girl, Marie Dubois, a prostitute from the port who sometimes came to beg in the neighborhood. She had disappeared at the end of August, and more recently, that old drunk who often slept in the alleys. George something, no one had seen him for 3 weeks. Outcasts, people no one really cared about, people with no family, no ties. Therese shook her head, trying to chase away her dark thoughts. "You're going crazy, Therese," she murmured to herself. "They're respectable shopkeepers. Edouard and Armand are honest men. But then, why couldn't they forget that smell? That stench of rotten meat that continued to rise from the basement from time to time despite their assurances? And why last night had she heard strange noises, scraping, muffled knocks coming from downstairs when it was almost 3:00 a.m.? A knock at her door startled the girl, spilling some herbal tea on her black dress. "Madame Morel, it's Claudette." Therese opened the door to her next-door neighbor, Claudette Renard, a vivacious young woman in her 30s, a seamstress by profession with red curls always escaping from her bun and an infectious smile. "Claudette, come in, please." The young woman entered, bringing with her a breath of fresh air and the scent of lavender. "I brought you some brioches from Madame Petty's. You look exhausted, Therese. Aren't you sleeping?" Therese hesitated, then decided to confide. "Claudette, have you noticed anything strange about the White brothers?" Claudette's smile faded slightly. She sat down on the chair by the window, her expression becoming more serious. "Strange in what way?" "The smells, the noises, the night, and the disappearances." Claudette frowned. "Are you talking about that old drunkard George? He's probably left town, Therese. These people never stay in one place for long. And the Italian and the girl Marie," insisted Therese, her voice rising slightly. "Claudette, that's 6 people in 4 months. 6, all people who frequented this neighborhood." Claudette looked at her for a long time, then lowered her voice. "You think not, Therese? That's ridiculous. They're meatballs, not—" She couldn't even finish her sentence. "I don't know what I'm thinking, me Therese," her hands trembling slightly, "but something's wrong in this house. I can feel it." Downstairs in the shop, Edouard was serving his customers with his usual enthusiasm. The morning had been particularly busy. Everyone wanted to stock up before Sunday. Madame Beaumont had returned, this time accompanied by the father of the field himself, who wanted to personally compliment the White brothers on the excellence of their pâté. "My children," said the priest, a portly man in his 60s with a round, jovial face. "It was truly divine. I've never tasted anything so unique. So what is your secret recipe?" Edward said warmly, his face beaming with feigned pride. "Ah, father, if I told you it would no longer be a secret, but I can assure you it's a love of the craft, a passion for good things." He paused dramatically. "A special ingredient that we procure with the utmost discretion." The father of the field nodded, impressed. "Keep your secret safe. I'll order 6 tureens for the bishop's reception next month." After the priest left, Armand emerged from the back room, his apron stained with what looked like fresh blood. "Citrine for the bishop," he said with a sardonic smile. "We will even honor the clergy with our art." "What an honor!" Edward gave him a warning look. "Be careful what you say, even when we're alone. The walls have ears." As if to confirm these words, they heard a creaking in the ceiling. Someone was walking in the apartment above. Mrs. Morel, she's becoming a real problem, Armand repeated, his tone hardening. I saw her watching us through the window last night. Edouard thought for a moment, his brain rapidly calculating the options. So we need to reassure her, invite her to dinner, maybe show that we're good neighbors, good people, or we could. No, Edouard cut in firmly. She lives here, she has friends in the neighborhood. Her disappearance would draw too much attention. You have to be smart, Armand. Always intelligent. That night, Therese was awakened by voices downstairs. She stood up silently, barefoot on the cold floor, and pressed her ear to the ground. The voices were muffled, but she could clearly make out two men, the White brothers, and a third, fainter, pleading voice. Please, I have money, I can pay. It was the voice of a young, terrified man. Then there was a dull thud, followed by a heavy silence. Therese put her hand to her mouth to stifle a scream. Her heart was beating so hard she was afraid he could hear it from downstairs. She remained frozen for what seemed like an eternity, listening to the sounds rising from the basement, scraping, heavy movements, the distinctive sound of metal tools. When everything fell silent again as the church clock struck 4:00 a.m., Therese made a decision. She had to speak to someone, someone with authority, someone who could investigate. At dawn the next morning, she went to the municipal gendarmerie station, a 20-minute walk away on Place de la République. The gray stone building with its blue shutters was imposing, a symbol of law and order. Inside, behind a desk cluttered with paperwork, stood Brigadier Lucien Moreau, a man in his 50s with a gray handlebar mustache and piercing steel-colored eyes. He was known to be a meticulous police officer, perhaps a little too rigid, but honest and dedicated. Madame Morel, he said, rising to greet her. What can I do for you at such an early hour? Therese sat on the hard wooden chair opposite him, her hands nervously gripping her reticule. Sergeant, I need to talk to you about the White brothers, my neighbors, the butchers on Market Street. Moreau frowned. I know the White brothers well, respectable shopkeepers. What's the problem? And then, in a trembling but determined voice, Therese told him everything. The smells, the nighttime noises, the disappearances, and especially what she had heard last night. When she finished, Sergeant Moreau remained silent for a long moment, tapping his desk with a pencil. These are very serious accusations, Madame Moreau, extremely serious. You understand that without concrete evidence, I can't just burst into their business, but disappearances, vagrants, prostitutes, drunks, Moreau interrupted her, not cruelly but factually. These people disappear all the time. That doesn't constitute proof. Therese felt tears well up. So you won't do anything? Sergeant Moreau looked at her for a long time, then sighed. I didn't say that. I'm going to make a few discreet checks, ask questions, keep a little watch. But I ask you, madam, not to speak of this to anyone. Else, if your suspicions are well-founded, and I mean if we shouldn't alert them. Do you understand? Therese nodded, a faint hope rising in her chest. Thank you, Sergeant, thank you. But as she left the police station and walked up the street toward her home, she didn't notice the figure he was watching from the corner of a building. Armand Blanc, who had gone out early that morning to get ice from the supplier, had just seen his neighbor leaving the police station. His face, usually impassive, twisted into an expression of cold rage. That evening, there would be an urgent conversation between the two brothers, and difficult decisions would have to be made. Brigadier Lucien Moreau was not a man to take things lightly. 30 years of service in the gendarmerie had taught him one essential thing: the intuitions of ordinary people, especially those of women who observe their neighborhoods daily, deserved to be taken seriously, even when they seemed extravagant. During the 3 days following Therese Morel's visit, he discreetly conducted his research. He consulted the missing persons registers. Officially, there had only been two in the last 4 months, and both were foreigners passing through. And by talking with other local shopkeepers, subtly questioning the tavern regulars, a pattern began to emerge. 6 people, maybe 7, all outsiders, all last seen in the Market Street area. Morrow sat in his dark office Friday night, a single oil lamp illuminating the notes scattered before him. He had also done something unusual. He had discreetly contacted a colleague in Lyon who had worked on a similar case 10 years ago. The story of a butcher who, no, he didn't even want to think about it. It was too monstrous, but the facts were there, scribbled in his notebook. Disappearance, geographical proximity, absence of a body, business. Meat business flourishing despite a difficult economic period. And that smell Madame Morel had mentioned, that smell of decay that didn't match that of normal animal meat. He would have to act, but cautiously. The White brothers were respected in the community. An unfounded accusation would destroy him professionally. He needed concrete proof. He decided that Monday morning he would pay an official visit to the White brothers under the guise of a routine health inspection. This would give him the opportunity to see the inside of their establishment, perhaps even the basement, without immediately arousing their suspicions. What he didn't know was that, while he was formulating his plan a few blocks away, the White brothers were formulating their own. In the dimly lit back room, Edouard and Armand sat facing each other around a small wooden table, a nearly empty bottle of red wine between them. The tension in the air was palpable. "She reported us," Armand said in a harsh voice, his eyes shining with a dangerous gleam. "That nosy old woman went to the police. I saw her with my own eyes leaving the police station." Edouard rubbed his temples, trying to think calmly despite the alcohol and the panic rising in him. "They have no evidence." "None. We were careful, meticulous, careful," Armand sneered. "Aim 'em. If the police come searching, they'll find the tools, Edouard, the traces. And downstairs in the cold room there's still more." "I know," Edouard hissed, banging his fist on the table. "You think I don't know? We have to clean everything up this weekend, make everything disappear. Every trace, every tool, every—" He didn't finish his sentence, and she asked Armand calmly, too calmly, "Madame Morel, we can't let her keep talking." Edouard stared at him, immediately understanding where his brother was going with this. "No, it's too risky. She literally lives above our heads." "Exactly," replied Armand with a cold smile, "a domestic accident, a fall down the stairs. These steps are so steep, so dangerous, especially at night." "You're crazy," Edouard murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm pragmatic," Armand corrected. "It's her or us, brother." If she kept talking, if the police really started investigating, he traced a finger across his throat in an unequivocal gesture. Edouard closed his eyes, the weight of their accumulated crimes suddenly weighing on his shoulders like a mountain. How had it come to this? It had started so innocently. Well, not innocently, it had started out of necessity. Their business was failing. They could no longer afford to buy quality meat from their usual suppliers. And then that vagabond, that first drunken vagabond, Carmen, had found them asleep in their alley, who had threatened them, who had tried to rob them. It had been self-defense at first. But then they had discovered that meat shouldn't be wasted, that no one was really looking for these people, that their pâté, their famous pâté, had an incomparable taste when made with that special ingredient, and he hadn't been able to stop. It had become an addiction, a game, a perversion. "Okay," Edouard said finally. "It barely sounds more than a whisper, but it must feel natural, absolutely natural." On Saturday morning, Therese woke up with a strange feeling, a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had spoken to Sergeant Morrow. Someone in authority knew now. She was no longer alone with her suspicions. She prepared her usual breakfast, stale bread dipped in coffee with milk, and sat down by her window. Outside, the market street was slowly coming to life. It was Saturday, the busiest day of the week for the shopkeepers. She saw Edouard open the shop's shutters, his usual smile in place, greeting the first customers who passed by. A shiver ran down her spine. How could he seem so normal, so ordinary if what she suspected was true? Around noon, there was a knock at her door. 3 light, almost friendly taps. When she opened it, she found Edouard Blanc on the landing, holding a plate covered with a clean white cloth. His smile was warm, his eyes sparkling with good nature. "Mrs. Morel," he said groaningly, "my brother and I noticed you've been looking tired lately. We thought a good meal would do you good." He handed her the plate, our house specialty, still warm from the oven. Therese stood there frozen, staring at the plate as if it were a poisonous snake. Beneath the cloth she could smell the rich, spicy aroma of their famous pâté. Her stomach lurched. "I'm very kind, but charge insists," said Edouard. His smile didn't waver an inch, but something in his eyes had changed. "Ungay, something hard." "Cold, it would offend us to refuse, madam. We've been neighbors for so long. We have to take care of each other, don't we?" There was an implicit threat in those words, a threat Therese understood perfectly. He knew that she had gone to the police. With trembling hands she took the plate. "Thank you, that's very thoughtful of you." "Bon appétit, Madame Morel," said Edouard, bowing slightly. "And be careful going down the stairs. They're so steep, so dangerous. Fall could be fatal." He turned on his heel and slowly descended the narrow staircase, leaving Therese alone with the plate in her hands and the terror that froze her blood. She hurriedly closed her door, locked it, then went straight to her window and threw the contents of the plate into the alley below. She watched the pâté smash onto the cobblestones, and she began to cry. Silent sobs of fear and despair. She was in danger. She knew it now for sure. She had to leave this place. Immediately, she began gathering her things into an old travel bag, her hands trembling so much that she dropped half of what she was trying to take. She would go to her sister's in Clermont-Ferrand. She would leave that very evening, as soon as nightfall. But as she, while frantically folding a dress, she heard a creak in the hallway. Someone was coming up the stairs slowly, deliberately. She froze, her heart beating so hard it hurt her chest. The footsteps stopped outside her door, a silence. Then the doorknob began to turn slowly. Therese had locked the door. The handle stopped turning. Another silence, even heavier. Then Armand's voice, deep and cold, echoed through the wood. "Madame Morel, we need to talk." She didn't answer, backing away toward the window, desperately searching for an escape route, but she was on the second floor. Jumping would be suicidal. "I know you're here," the voice continued. "We know where you went Thursday morning. We know what you said." A violent knock shook the door. Then another. The ancient wood was beginning to creak around the lock. Therese rushed to her small bedside table and grabbed the bronze candlestick, her only weapon. She began to scream at the top of her lungs for help. One last blow and the door shattered. Armand stood in the doorway, a heavy butcher's hammer in his hand, his cold eyes fixed on her like a predator on its prey. "You shouldn't have interfered in our affairs, madame," he said, slowly advancing into the room. But Therese's note had brought it. In the stairway, voices were rising. Claudette, the seamstress, and Monsieur Fontaine, the shoemaker, from the ground floor. "What's going on up there?" Armand stopped, calculating quickly. He couldn't murder with witnesses so close. He cast one last murderous look at Therese, then disappeared down the service stairs that led directly to the back alley. A few seconds later, Claudette and Monsieur Fontaine burst into the room, finding Therese collapsed on the floor in tears, still clutching her candlestick. "My God, Therese, what happened?" "Your door, the police," she managed between sobs. "We must call the police immediately." An hour later, Sergeant Mara was in Therese Morel's devastated room, examining the broken door and listening to the woman's story. Claudette and Monsieur Fontaine confirmed they had heard the screams and seen the door broken down. They tried to kill me, Theres repeated, still in shock. Because of what I told you, he knew. He knew I had gone to see you. Morrow felt anger rising within him. He had been too cautious, too slow. He should have acted immediately. Monsieur Fontaine, he said in an authoritarian voice, go get my men. From the police station, tell them to bring reinforcements. We're going to search the White Brothers' shop. Now in the butcher's shop, Edouard and Armand had heard the commotion. They knew it was over. Their reign of terror was coming to an end. We have to leave, Edouard said already, stuffing money into a bag. Now, through the back alley, we can take the train to Paris. But no, Armand interrupted, his voice strangely calm. It's too late to run away. They'll find us. Wherever we go, they'll find us. So what do we do? Edouard's voice was now tinged with panic. Armand looked at his brother for a long time, then at the door leading to the basement. We wipe away the ordeal, the whole ordeal. And before Edouard could understand what he meant, Armand had grabbed a flashlight troll and threw it violently against the back wall. The glass shattered, the oil spilled, and within seconds flames began to devour the ancient wood. You're crazy, yelled Edouard. Are you going to kill us? Armand replied with a terrible smile. But they'll never find any proof. Never. The fire spread with terrifying speed, fueled by the grease, oils, and dry wood filling the shop. Within minutes, the entire ground floor was ablaze. Upstairs, Sergeant Morrow saw smoke seeping under the door. Fire, the house is on fire. He grabbed Theres by the arm. Quick, outside, everyone outside. They rushed down the outside stairs as the flames were already licking the ground floor windows. In the street, people were screaming, running in all directions. The church alarm bells began to ring, calling for the volunteer firefighters. Through the heat-splintered windows, Mora thought he saw two figures in the blazing inferno. The White Brothers still inside, not even trying to escape. They're still in there, shouted someone. But it was already too late to save them. The entire building had become a roaring inferno. Beams collapsed with deafening cracks. The heat was so intense that people had to retreat further and further. Brigadier Morrow stood there helplessly, watching as the fire consumed not only the White Brothers' shop, but with it, almost all the evidence of their abominable crimes. Sunday morning dawned on a desolate site. Where the White Brothers' butcher shop once stood, nothing remained but a smoking pile of rubble, charred beams, and collapsed walls. The acrid smell of smoke permeated the entire neighborhood, mingling with another odor, a smell of burning flesh that made the stomach of anyone who approached it churn. Brigadier Lucien Morrow hadn't slept all night. He had stayed on. The firefighters were overseeing the firefighters' efforts. Then, once the fire was under control, organizing the search for bodies, they found two charred corpses in what remained of the back shop, almost unrecognizable but identifiable by their size and position as Edouard and Armand Blanc. But that wasn't all they found. As the sun reached its zenith, the Morrow team, consisting of 3 gendarmes and a forensic pathologist from Clermont-Ferrand, methodically explored the ruins. The basement, partially protected by its stone construction, had better resisted the fire, and it was there in what had been the cold room that they made the discovery that would transform this local tragedy into a national scandal. Sergeant, you should see this. Constable Tessier's voice trembled. Morrow cautiously descended the blackened stone steps, a flashlight in his hand. The smell was unbearable, rotten meat, smoke, and something more deeply nauseating. When he reached the bottom, he understood why Tessier was so upset. Hanging from butcher's hooks, partially consumed but still identifiable, were pieces of human flesh, arms, legs, torso, carefully cut and prepared like quarters of meat. In a corner, a barrel filled with salt and brine contained other better preserved parts. And on a shelf, miraculously intact, a series of glass jars containing what looked like organs in formaldehyde. But the most horrifying thing was the notebook. A thick black leather-bound ledger lay on a work table against the far wall. The fire had spared it. Morrow opened it with trembling hands, and what he read inside made him reel. It was a meticulous journal of their crime. Each victim was listed with a name when he knew it, a date, a place of capture, and most horrifyingly, notes on the preparation and use of the meat, recipes, taste evaluations, and comments on which part was best for which product. My God, Mara murmured, the pages trembling between his fingers. My almighty God, there were 14 names in the register. 14 victims over a period of 2 years, not 6. 14. The medical examiner, Dr. Antoine Riviere, a man in his 50s with gray hair and a stern face, examined the remains with a clinical professionalism that barely concealed his disgust. These are definitely human remains, he confirmed in a raspy voice. The cuts are precise, professional. He knew what he was doing. He stopped sliding. With difficulty. Brigadier, according to the notes in this register, they sold this meat for 2 years too. Hundreds of customers. The silence that followed this statement was heavy, stifling. Morrow felt bile rise in his throat. How many people had eaten? No, he couldn't think about it. Not now. No one must know. He said suddenly. His voice was hard and authoritative. Not the details, not what we found in this ledger. Dr. Riviere stared at him incredulously. Brigadier, we can't keep this a secret. The victims' families have the right to. The families interrupted Morrow bitterly. Most of these victims had no family. They were vagrants, prostitutes, outcasts. He pointed toward the stairs, toward the neighborhood beyond. But up there, hundreds of people ate at the White Brothers, respectable families, priests, magistrates. Do you want to tell them they were? He couldn't finish his sentence. We must follow procedure, the doctor insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Morrow thought quickly. Part of him wanted justice to be done, for the truth to be known, but another part, the pragmatic part that had survived 30 years in the gendarmerie, knew that some truths were too destructive to be fully revealed. Here's what we're going to do, he said finally. The official report will mention the discovery of human remains in the basement. We'll confirm that the White brothers were murderers. We'll identify the victims when possible. But the details about the sale, the distribution, stay between us. He looked each of the men present in the eye, one by one. We must protect this community. If the complete truth comes out, it will destroy this neighborhood, maybe even this city. People won't be able to look at each other without wondering. He left his sentence hanging. After a long silence, Dr. Riviere nodded slowly. Okay, but only if we find all the possible victims. They deserve at least a decent burial. Accepted. The following days were among the darkest in Aurillac history. The White Brothers affair, or at least the stripped-down version that Brigadier Morrow allowed to be made public, was on the front page of every regional newspaper. Aurillac's cannibalistic morsels headlined the little Auvergnat. 14 murders in a neighborhood butcher shop, proclaimed the Cantal newspaper. Thérèse Morel, the heroine despite herself, was besieged by journalists. She told her story again and again. The suspicious smells, the nighttime noises, her visit to the police station, the attempted intimidation, the broken door. She became a symbol of civic courage, the ordinary woman who had dared to defy evil. But she no longer slept. Every night she saw Armand Blanc's face in her doorway, the hammer raised. Every night she woke up sweating, screaming in the darkness. Claudette, her faithful neighbor, often came to sleep on the sofa in her room so she wouldn't be alone. The atmosphere in the neighborhood was heavy, sickening. People avoided talking to each other, looked away when they passed each other in the street. Everyone silently wondered, had he eaten the White brothers' pâté? Had he unknowingly contributed to perpetuating this horror? Madame Beaumont, who had religiously bought the pâté every week for 2 years, no longer left her house. It was said that she wept day and night. The father of the field, who had invented the excellence of their terrine, went on a 3-week spiritual retreat in a monastery seeking forgiveness and purification. The restaurant Le Sanglier d'Or closed its doors. Its owner, unable to bear the weight of guilt, had served the White Brothers pâté to hundreds of customers for months. Meanwhile, in the destroyed basement of what had been the shop, Brigadier Morrow and his team continued their gruesome work. They found other remains, other clues. Thanks to the meticulous register kept by the brothers, they were able to identify 9 of the 14 victims, Salvator and Benedetti. 34 years old, Italian peddler Marie Dubois, 22, prostitute George Zarnaud, 61, homeless Henry Constant, 28, vagabond Jean Mercier, 45, beggar Thomas Valentin, 19, army deserter Catherine Roussel, 37, laundress who disappeared on her way to work Alexander Dubois, 40, drunkard from the Port District Marguerite Fontaine, 67, former seamstress who fell into poverty. The other 5 remained anonymous. The brothers had identified them only by cruel nicknames in their register: the lame one, the redhead, the old man, the fat one, the kid. All the identified victims had no close family, or their families were too poor or too distant to have reported them missing. It was this social invisibility that had allowed the White Brothers to operate for so long without being bothered. The following Saturday, 3 weeks after the fire, a ceremony was held at the St. Pierre d'Aurillac Church. The remains of all the victims, what could be recovered, were placed in a collective coffin and buried in a special section of the communal cemetery. A simple tombstone was erected bearing the inscription, "To the innocent victims of the White Brothers 1880-7189. May their souls rest in peace." More than 300 people attended the funeral, a massive presence that demonstrated less compassion for the victims than a collective need to turn the page, to make a gesture of penance for a crime in which the entire community had unwittingly participated. The father of the field, pale and emaciated by his ordeal, celebrated the Mass with a broken voice. "We pray today not only for these innocent souls snatched from life most horribly," he said, his hands trembling on the elf, "but also for ourselves, for our blindness, for our unwitting complicity. May God forgive us. May he forgive us." Thérèse Morel was in the front row, supported by Claudette on one side and Brigadier Morrow on the other. She wept silently, her tears streaming continuously down her hollow cheeks. She had lost 10 kg since the incident. Her hair had turned even grayer. She looked like she had aged 10 years in 3 weeks. After the ceremony, as people slowly dispersed, Brigadier Morrow approached her. "Madame Morel," he said softly, "I wanted to tell you, without you, they would have continued. Perhaps for years to come. You saved lives." Thérèse looked at him with blank eyes. "I should have spoken sooner. As soon as I sensed something was wrong, those people might still be alive." "You couldn't have known," Morrow said firmly. "No one could have imagined." He paused, searching for words. "What you did took courage, extraordinary courage." But Thérèse shook her head. She knew she would carry this guilt with her for the rest of her life, and in her nightmares she would always see Edouard Blanc smiling at her, handing her that plate of pâté with that implicit threat in his eyes. Some horrors, she knew now, never truly fade. They leave invisible but indelible scars on the soul. Some horrors, she knew now, never truly fade. She leaves invisible but indelible scars on the soul. 6 months had passed. Since the fire, March 1890 brought with it the renewal of spring. Buds burst on the trees. Wildflowers carpeted the hills around Aurillac, and birds returned from their winter migration. Nature, in its eternal indifference, continued its immutable cycle. But on Market Street, Nothing had returned to normal. The land where the White Brothers butcher shop once stood remained empty. The rubble had been removed, but no new construction had begun. People avoided the place like a cemetery. They crossed sidewalks as they passed by, quickened their pace, and looked away. Children whispered that moans could be heard at night, that the ghosts of the victims still haunted the place. Adults claimed not to believe these stories, but none would have dared to cross that road, a space after sunset. The neighborhood itself had changed. Several families had moved, unable to bear the weight of what had happened. The remaining businesses struggled to attract customers who wanted to buy meat in a neighborhood where 2 bites had turned out to be cannibals. The neighboring butcher shops had seen their sales plummet by 60, and some had had to close. Theory's morale still lived above the empty lot, but it wasn't really living anymore. It was surviving day after day in a state of constant vigilance and residual terror. She had lost her job as a waiter. Her hands trembled too much to do meticulous work. She subsisted on a small pension the municipality paid her in recognition of her civic courage. But money didn't heal the wounds of the soul. Claudette came to see her every faithful day. Despite everything, that morning, a gray Tuesday and older, she brought fresh bread and milk. "Theres, you must eat," she said softly, finding her friend sitting by the window as always, staring into the void below. "You didn't eat anything yesterday." "I can't," Theres murmured. Her voice had become weak, worn. "Every time I see food, I think of you." She didn't finish her sentence. Claudette knelt beside her, taking her icy hands in hers. "They're dead, Theres. They can't hurt you anymore. They can't hurt anyone anymore." But Heresy shakes her head. "You don't understand. It's not just that. It could have been anyone. My neighbors, my friends. How do we trust again when we've discovered that evil can hide behind any smile?" That was the question haunting the entire neighborhood, the entire city. How do we rebuild trust when it had been so profoundly betrayed? At the same time, at the gendarmerie, Brigadier Lucien Moreau sat at his desk, rereading the White Brothers register for the 100th time. He had never revealed its full contents to the public. The most sordid details, the cruel descriptions, the notes on the taste and texture of human flesh. Those pages remained locked in his personal safe, a secret he would take to his grave. But something gnawed at him, a question that remained unanswered. Why? Why had these 2 men, who by all accounts had had normal childhoods, a decent upbringing, and no signs of violence or cruelty before opening their business, become such monsters? The register gave no clue to their underlying motivation. It was purely factual, almost clinical in its horror. A young gendarme, Marcel Dupont, knocked on his door. "Sergeant, there's someone who wants to speak to you. She says it's about the White Brothers." Morrow sighed. Despite the passing months, he still received regular visits from people with information to share, theories to propose, or simply the need to discuss the case. Enter. The woman who entered was elderly, probably in her 60s, bent over by arthritis, with snow-white hair and a wrinkled face but surprisingly bright eyes. She wore a worn morning dress and leaned heavily on a cane. "Sergeant Morrow," she said in a quavering voice. "My name is Helene Blanc. I was Edouard and Armand's aunt." Morrow sat up abruptly in his chair. No member of the Blanc family had come forward since the incident. He had assumed he lived too far away, or that they were dead, or simply that he preferred to deny any connection with the 2 murderers. "Madame Blanc," he said, getting up to offer her a chair. "I'm surprised. Please sit down." She settled with difficulty, resting her cane against the desk. Her knobbly hands trembled slightly. "I've lived in Bordeaux for 20 years. I only learned what happened a month ago when my son-in-law showed me an article in the newspaper." She closed her eyes for a moment as if gathering courage. "I had to come. I had to tell you, madame, what happened when they were children." Her gaze became distant, lost in memories she would have preferred to forget. "You see, Sergeant, evil doesn't Occur overnight, it must be cultivated. Slowly, insidiously, Morrow took out his notebook, pen in hand. I'm listening. Helene Blanc took a long, shaky breath. Their father, my brother Charles, was stubborn, a good butcher, respected in his profession. But he was also a cruel, violent man, especially when he drank. And he drank often. She paused, her eyes filling with tears. Their mother, Pauline, was a gentle woman, fragile. She died when Edouard was 12 and Armand was 9. Charles had beaten her one too many times. Officially, it was a fall down the stairs, but we all knew the truth. After Pauline's death, she continued, her voice breaking. Charles became even darker. He forced the boys to work in his butcher's shop, from dawn until late at night. No school, no friends, just work and punishments. What kind of punishment? Morrow asked, although he already feared the answer. He locked them in the cold room for hours, sometimes all night in the dark, surrounded by hanging animal carcasses. She shivered. He said it toughened them up, that it would make real meatballs of them. Morrow felt an icy chill run down his spine. Madame, why didn't anyone intervene? I tried, she said, tears now flowing freely down her wrinkled cheeks. I tried to take them with me to Bordeaux, but Charles refused. He said they were his sons, his property, and the law was on his side. In those days, no one interfered in family matters. When Charles died, he drowned himself drunk in the river when Edward had 18 years old. I thought the boys would finally be free, that they could heal. But she shook her head sadly. You don't recover from that kind of childhood, not really. The poison was already in their souls, or say they inherited their father's shop. Yes, they sold it and left for Aurillac. They wanted a fresh start, they said, far from the memories. She laughed bitterly. But you can't run away. Her inner demons, brigadiers, we always carry them with us. Morrow reflected on her words. Madame Blanc, what you describe to me is tragic, truly. Tragic, but many people have difficult childhoods without becoming ill churches, without becoming what they became. I know, she said softly. I'm not trying to excuse them. What they did is unforgivable, monstrous. I came simply so that you would understand, so that the world would understand. That monsters are not born in a vacuum. They are created, shaped by cruelty, abuse, and desensitization too. Suffering, she stood up with difficulty, leaning on her cane. My brother Charles created his monster brigadiers. And then they created their own victim. It's a cycle of violence that perpetuates itself from generation to generation, until someone dares to break it. After she left, Morrow sat for a long time in the silence of his office, pondering her words. Did he understand better now why Edouard and Armand had become who they were? Perhaps. Did it change the horror of their crime? Absolutely not. But it reminded him of something important. Evil is not an abstract external force. It grows in the dark corners of our lives, nourished by cruelty, indifference, and the silence of witnesses. At the Aurillac cemetery, Thérèse Morel stood before the collective grave of the victims. She had come there every week since the funeral, bringing fresh flowers when she could afford it. Today, she had wild violets she had picked by the river. As she laid the flowers down, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw a man in his 40s in simple but clean clothes who held his hat nervously in his hands. Madame Morel, he said hesitantly. My name is Pierre Constant. Henry Constant was my brother. Thérèse's heart sank. Henry Constant was one of the names in the register, a 28-year-old vagrant. Monsieur Constant, she said softly, I'm sorry for your loss. The man approached the grave, tears shining in his eyes. We had had a fight, a stupid quarrel over money. Henry left in a huff and I never saw him again. For months I looked for him. And then I read it in the newspaper. Her voice broke. Was he among the victims? Thérèse asked, although she already knew the answer. Yes, the police contacted me. They identified his remains by an old wound on his arm he'd sustained as a child. He knelt before the tombstone, placing his hand on the cold marble. If only I hadn't argued with him, if only I'd held him back that day. Therese knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. It's not your fault, Mr. Constant. It's theirs, only theirs, but I let him go without a Glock. I left him vulnerable and unprotected. We all have regrets, Therese said softly, thinking of all the times she'd sensed something was wrong but waited to act. But we can't bear the guilt for the crimes committed by others. We simply can't, or that guilt will destroy us. She realized as she spoke the words that she was speaking as much to herself as to him. For 6 months she had let guilt and fear consume her. She had survived, but she hadn't truly lived. It was time to begin healing. They lay there together for a long time, two wounded souls sharing their pain before this grave that held so much suffering. When they finally stood up, they did so together, supporting each other. You know, Pierre Constant said, wiping his eyes, people in the village tell me you're a hero, that without you they would have carried on. Therese shook her head. I'm not a hero. I just did what was right, what anyone should have done, but not everyone did, he replied firmly. You did it, and thanks to you, perhaps my brother and the others can finally rest in peace. Weeks passed, then months. Summer arrived, warm and bright, drying the last traces of winter dampness on the stones of Aurillac. Slowly, very slowly, life returned to Market Street. A new family bought the land where the White Friar's butcher shop had stood. They built not a business, but a small chapel, a place of prayer and contemplation dedicated to the memory of the victims. The father of the field, who had found a path to personal redemption in faith, became the volunteer caretaker. Therese Morel began to sleep again. Although the nightmares still returned sometimes, she found a new job. Modest but honest, helping Claudette in her sewing workshop. The two women had become inseparable, bonded by the ordeal they had been through together. Sergeant Morrow was promoted to chief inspector and transferred to Clermont-Ferrand. Before leaving, he paid Therese one last visit. I wanted to thank you, he said, standing in her small, sunny room. Without your courage, this case would never have been solved. Courage, Therese repeated with a sad smile. I was just too scared to stay silent. That is exactly what courage is, Morrow replied. It's not the absence of fear, it's acting despite fear. He handed her an envelope. This is for you, a government award for exceptional civic service. It's not much, but Therese opened the envelope and saw that it contained 500 francs, a considerable sum, enough to live comfortably for over a year. Tears welled up in her eyes. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Morrow said kindly. Use this money to start over, to live. That's what the victims would have wanted. After he left, Therese stood for a long time contemplating the envelope in her hands. Then she looked out the window at the market street below. People came and went, going about their daily business. Children played in the street. A greengrocer hawked his wares. Life went on. And for the first time since that terrible September day, Therese felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. 10 years later, in 1900, a young journalist from Paris came to Aurillac to write an article on the Cannibal for Le Figaro. The affair had become legendary, told and retold to the point of taking on almost mythical proportions. He searched for Therese Morel and found her running a small haberdashery in the market square, prosperous and respected. She was now 60 years old, her hair completely white, but her eyes had regained their liveliness. Madame Morel, asked the journalist, notebook in hand, how did you feel when you discovered the truth about your neighbors? Have you never regretted reporting them? Therese looked at him for a long time before replying. Young man, the regret would have been to remain silent, to be afraid, to let evil flourish through my silence. She paused. What I learned from this terrible ordeal is that evil exists. It really exists. not in factual accounts or horror stories, but here among us in our streets, perhaps even at our doorsteps. And what should we do when we encounter it? The journalist asked. We fight it, Theres replied simply. Not with weapons, not with violence, but with the truth, with the courage to speak out when something is wrong, with a refusal to look away when it would be easier to see nothing. She stood up from her chair, signaling that the interview was over. Evil triumphs when good people do nothing. That is the only lesson I learned from this story, the only one that really matters. Evening was falling on Auric in the small chapel built on the ruins of the old butcher's shop. Candles burned softly, their flickering light casting dancing shadows on the white walls. The father of the field recited his daily prayer for the souls of the victims. In her room above the haberdashery, Therese Morel prepared for the night. She was no longer afraid of the dark now. She had looked evil in the face and survived. She was stronger for it. But before extinguishing her lamp, she did what she had done every night for 10 years. She recited the names, the 14 names of the victims that she had learned by heart. Salvator, Marie, George, Henry, Jean, Thomas, Catherine, Alexander, Marguerite, and the 5 others whose real names would remain forever unknown but who deserve to be honored just as much. May your souls rest in peace, she whispered. In the darkness, you are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten. And perhaps somewhere in the night, these tormented souls finally found a little comfort. The story of the White Brothers is not simply the story of 2 monstrous murderers. It is the story of 14 lives stolen, of hundreds of people traumatized, of a community shattered and then slowly rebuilt. It is the story of the courage of an ordinary woman who refused to be silent. It is the story of fragility, of human trust, and of the resilience of the human spirit. But it is also a warning, a reminder that evil is not always obvious, that it can wear a smiling face, run a respectable shop, be your neighbor, your shopkeeper, someone you trust, that you must remain vigilant, question what seems strange, speak up when something is wrong. For as Therese Morel said, evil triumphs when good people do nothing. In 1889, on a small street in Aurillac, people unknowingly ate the flesh of their fellow human beings. It's a horrible, almost unbelievable truth. But it happened, and it reminds us that behind the counter of a simple market, behind any friendly smile, something unimaginably dark can lurk. Stay vigilant, stay courageous, and above all, never be afraid to speak the truth, even when it is terrifying. Because sometimes that truth is the only thing that can save lives.